Legend of Exorcism. Chapter 71. A promise not lightly made. One Shishan later, in the village, Hung Jun pushed open the door to a residence. This was a village that had been trampled over by the corpse ghosts that fell in battle, and every home had long since fallen into disrepair, completely uninhabited. After Li Jinglong settled his horse for the night, he and Hung Jun sat in one of the houses and started a fire, the two of them leaning against each other. Hung Jun placed the phoenix tail feather in front of Li Jinglong's inner robe, yet Li Jinglong replied quietly, "I'm not cold." Hung Jun moved to press his hand against Li Jinglong's forehead, only for Li Jinglong to catch it, holding it between his own hands. The two of them watched the fire in the stove quietly, lost in their thoughts. "You're missing home, is that it?" "No," Hung Jun replied dejectedly. Li Jinglong comforted him. "I believe that night, Chongming didn't mean it. A father will not refuse to let his child come home." Hung Jun replied, "Going back this time is only because I want to figure out the truth." Li Jinglong's eyebrows furrowed as Hung Jun murmured, "Yaojin Palace was once my home, but after I learned of the past, all that changed." After that, he told Li Jinglong what the Ghost King had said. Li Jinglong had never expected that things were actually like this. In the end, Hung Jun said bleakly, "Treating Yaojin Palace as my home was perhaps nothing more than wishful thinking on my part." "Go back ba," Li Jinglong suddenly said. "Hung Jun." Hung Jun raised his head to look at Li Jinglong, but Li Jinglong said, "Return to the exorcism department, the exorcism department is your new home. I promise you." The hand that Li Jinglong had slung on his shoulders came down, and he pressed it against Hung Jun's chest instead as he picked up Hung Jun's right hand, pressing that palm against his own chest. "As long as my heart still beats," Li Jinglong said earnestly, "Hung Jun, you will never become Mara, nor will you become a monster. You will always stay by my side, and for every day that the exorcism department exists, you will never have no place to return to. As long as I am alive, whenever you open that door, I will be waiting for you in the exorcism department." Hung Jun's heart began to beat violently, as if there was an icy river at the bottom of his heart slowly cracking, letting out light sounds. When Hung Jun heard these words, he was a little at a loss for what to do. As soon as his gaze met Li Jinglong's, he couldn't resist wanting to duck away from his gaze. "I won't," Hung Jun said in the end. "Then I'll go with you," Li Jinglong said. "Wherever you go, I will go with you." Hung Jun's breathing quickened. He didn't know what had come over him today, but ever since Li Jinglong had discovered that he had run off and came chasing after him, his heart had kept seizing again and again. He hated him a little, but with that hate came something he couldn't describe clearly, something he wasn't sure of, some other kind of emotion. Especially when Li Jinglong had grabbed him and shouted, "The way I treated you," that had made him nearly unable to breathe. "What's wrong now?" Li Jinglong asked, not understanding. "Nothing," Hung Jun immediately said. "I'm tired. I want to sleep for a bit." So Li Jinglong hugged him, saying, "Sleep ba." The weather was icy cold, and though Li Jinglong's hug was extremely warm, just like it had always been, there was a different feeling than usual. His body gave off a light scent of sweat from those several days of racing after him, and that warm light in his chest caused Hung Jun to feel both infatuated and at peace. Ever since he had that dream, this was the night that he slept the most soundly, as if the snow filling the world outside this little house was glowing with the warm, white light of the heart lamp. He had a dream, and in his dream he actually returned to the hot springs on Mt. Li. The two of them were both fully naked, standing in the water, and Li Jinglong was applying medicine to his ear. Because their naked bodies were pressed together, Hung Jun's face was bright red, and he tried to duck away, but Li Jinglong pulled him back. "Just, like this. Like this, like this. Hey. Let go of me." In Pinkong Li shining brightly with the gaudy lights of revelry, that night when they were hunting down the fox Yao among the alleys, Li Jinglong had, with a serious expression, explained the entire process to him. That description had been extremely detailed and vigorous, and as Hung Jun listened, his handsome face had gone bright red, and he had started to have a reaction. Stripped bare and embraced. Outside of Pinkongli, Li Jinglong had described it to him in apparent seriousness, and that seemed to meld strangely with the scene of the two of them standing in the hot springs, pressed close together. Right after that, he put a hand to the side of Hung Jun's face, lowered his head, and kissed him. Hung Jun's heartbeats immediately sped up, just like how it had when Li Jinglong had held his hands that night, stared into his eyes, and made his promise. Li Jinglong spread Hung Jun's fingers apart, and the two of them laced all 10 of their fingers together. The tremors from those movements reached directly to his heart. Hung Jun shifted at that and woke, only to suddenly feel that as he dreamed, he had accidentally come. Li Jinglong, however, was still sleeping soundly, his fingers still twined with Hung Jun's own. Outside, the snow had stopped. Hung Jun lifted a knee, only to feel that a large area around his crotch was wet. His expression was one of complete wretchedness, and he carefully pulled out his fingers from Li Jinglong's. Last night, they had fallen asleep upright, leaning against each other, and Hung Jun had pillowed himself on half of Li Jinglong's body, which had gone numb. Thankfully, Li Jinglong had yet to realize anything. What to do, what to do? His pants were wet. And there was nowhere to wash it. Hung Jun looked towards the outer robes that had been draped off to one side, and he pulled over a corner of one. He tugged it in between his thighs to wipe. Li Jinglong had also woken, but he didn't make a sound, instead opening his eyes and watching Hung Jun's actions oddly. Hung Jun hadn't sensed his gaze yet. His face was bright red as he sat there cross-legged, pulling open his pants as he ducked his head, reaching in to wipe. Li Jinglong scooted over and took a look, before he suddenly burst out with laughter. Hung Jun immediately let out a loud shout and gave Li Jinglong a punch, almost breaking his bones. Half a shishan later, the two of them rode over the snowy plains, taking the closest main road towards Liangzhou city. It was the second day of the new year, and the ground in front of the entrances to every household was covered in the red confetti of the firecrackers, like red flowers blooming in the snow. Li Jinglong raged, "You almost broke my ribs." Hung Jun turned his head back, gritting his teeth as he eked out, "Stop talking about it." "Hey," Li Jinglong said. "What did you dream of this time? Did you dream of Gag?" When Hung Jun heard this, he exploded, and he couldn't help but want to beat him up. But Li Jinglong kept asking. "That wasn't your first time, was it?" "It wasn't." Hung Jun roared angrily. "If you bring it up anymore, I'm going to ignore you." Li Jinglong followed behind him at an unhurried pace. After the two of them entered Liangzhou city, Li Jinglong first took the reins of the horses, making Hung Jun wait outside as he bought him a new inner shirt and shorts, and after that, they went to the bathhouse. They hadn't bathed for a good half a month by now, and finally Hung Jun could wash up properly and change his clothes. "After you finish bathing, wait for me outside," Li Jinglong said. "Where are you going?" Hung Jun asked, confused. "To deliver a letter," Li Jinglong replied. "To tell the brothers of the exorcism department that I found you." Hung Jun sank into the bathtub and let out a long exhale. This was not the first time that he had had a wet dream. Several years ago, he had some in Yaojin Palace as well. At that time, he thought that he had wet the bed, and he was terrified of Chongming finding out and scolding him, so he hid his pants away. Only later did he understand what had happened. At that time, when he had dreamt, what had he dreamed of? It was as if someone was calling him, and he had also fought with a youth who was about the same age as him. As they fought, his opponent had kissed him. Hung Jun shook his head, tossing that confused jumble of thoughts out of his mind. Why had he dreamt of Li Jinglong last night? Dreaming about him was one thing, but dreaming about him in the hot springs. As Hung Jun continued thinking about it, he couldn't resist getting hard again, and he shrank into the water, his head spinning and his vision blurry as he soaked there. Only after pouring a ladleful of cold water over his head did he feel somewhat better. After he finished washing and walked out, Li Jinglong still hadn't come back. In a side room outside the bathing chambers, an attendant had set out a food box, saying that this was according to Zhenqi's commands, so that he could eat first. With that, Hung Jun began to eat. It was afternoon now, and as he kept waiting, Li Jinglong didn't return. Hung Jun suddenly felt as if he had been left behind on the second day of the new year. Liangzhou city was filled with joyous festivity. Only he himself sat in this foreign city, not recognizing a single person here. Even the Carpiao hadn't come with him. Footsteps sounded, and Hung Jun thought that Li Jinglong had returned. He peeked out, only to find that it was a bathhouse attendant. What if he left now? Hung Jun thought over it again and again, but after thinking about how he had caused Li Jinglong to chase after him for a whole day and night, he really couldn't bear to do such a thing again. When exactly is he coming back? Hung Jun felt as if he was starting to lose his mind. But just at this instant, Li Jinglong appeared from around the corner of the screen, watching him curiously. Li Jinglong had just finished bathing, and his hair was still half wet as he sat down. Things are finally taken care of. Hung Jun said, since you got back already, why didn't you say anything? Li Jinglong observed his gaze, saying, you're angry again. He then understood, and he chuckled. You've waited a long time, right? Why didn't you even make some tea to drink? And saying this, he put the copper kettle on the small stove, pulling a food box towards him as he began to eat. I won't go back to Chang'an, Hung Jun said sulkily. I know, Li Jinglong replied easily. In a bit, we'll set out to the Taihang Mountains. Hung Jun studied him, before asking, you're really going? Of course, Li Jinglong answered, as if that was expected. Hung Jun couldn't resist looking at Li Jinglong. He hadn't felt this before, but after the events of last night, he suddenly felt that from his body, there was an aura of extreme charisma. His features were the deep-set ones of the Han people, his eyebrows pointed like swords, his eyes bright like stars, and his body was also very well sculpted. But the center of his brow seemed to have an air to it that kept strangers away. Aside from when he smiled, he often had this kind of expression on his face. It left the hearts of those looking feeling itchy, so they could not resist wanting to make him angry, or lash out and strike at him. After Li Jinglong finished eating, he moved to make the tea. He first poured out a cup for Hung Jun, then thought deeply as he drank his own cup. Hung Jun knew that Li Jinglong was cooking up some plan again, so he said, then we must first agree on 3 rules. Li Jinglong almost spat out his tea. He looked at Hung Jun, saying, name them. After we get to Yejin Palace, you must listen to me, Hung Jun replied. Li Jinglong said, that's expected. Going to your house means that a guest should act according to what the host sees fit. What else? Hung Jun thought for a bit, before finally saying, there's nothing else. Li Jinglong. You were gone for so long, weren't you afraid of me leaving? Hung Jun asked. Since I caught up to you once, you won't run anymore, Li Jinglong said. Though he was steeping the tea, his eyes were watching Hung Jun, and he chuckled. You can't bear losing me. At that sentence, Hung Jun's heart was once again tugged at, and it ached for a time. After drinking the tea, Li Jinglong paid for their meal, before leading Hung Jun away from Liangzhou. As they left the city, Hung Jun had just mounted his horse when Li Jinglong vaulted on right behind, sitting behind him. He explained, I had them go back to Chang'an first, so that they could pay close attention to the Yao King's movements at any time. Let's go, Xia. Hung Jun. Hung Jun protested, I won't ride the same horse as you dash. Each of us has one steed, why are you squeezing with me? Li Jinglong shook the reins, his sturdy chest pressing against Hung Jun's back, saying, "You don't need to take control of the reins, isn't this good?" Before, Hung Jun had pretty much gotten completely used to it, and hadn't even found coming into contact with Li Jinglong's body something strange. Now, however, when Li Jinglong leaned forward even slightly as he directed the horse, that sense of oppression immediately caused him to grow very nervous. Thankfully, the distance they had to travel was not very far. When they arrived at the way station, the sky was already dark and the villages had already long since gone to rest, as it was the new year. After running for less than a handful of shishan, Li Jinglong went to get them lodgings. Hung Jun held the reins to the horse, listening to Li Jinglong talking with the waiter. He had the waiter prepare some wine and food to celebrate, so they could have something good that night. Hung Jun peeked in secretly from behind the door, and without knowing why, he grew nervous again. After Li Jinglong had settled things, he turned to go find Hung Jun, only to see him hiding behind the door. He couldn't help but find that funny, and he walked towards him. "What are you peeking at?" Li Jinglong asked mirthfully. "What exactly are you thinking about all day long, you little brat?" When the two of them were riding, Li Jinglong's chest had been pressed against his back, separated only by a warm outer robe. That sturdy, powerful heart thumped, giving Hung Jun a sense of incomparable ease, as if he had a place to return to. He had already slowly come to accept his parents' departure as he had grown up. But what he hated upon waking from that dream, the pain that he was hard-pressed to bear, came more from discovering that the person responsible for his parents' death was actually Li Jinglong. Hung Jun turned his head, taking a look at Li Jinglong sleeping next to him. His sleeping face was handsome and composed, and his lips were smooth and slightly parted. His nose bridge rose tall from the side profile of his face, and his eyebrows and eyes were clear and distinct. As he looked, Hung Jun once again began to feel a little hatred towards him. If that hadn't happened, then perhaps he'd still have someone to depend on. He turned over, facing the wall, his tangled heart filled with pain. The two of them set off again the next day. But just as Li Jinglong was about to take the lead, Hung Jun climbed on his horse first and sped off. Li Jinglong said, "What are you running this fast for?" He could only go chasing after him. Throughout this journey, Hung Jun's heart had been filled with uncertainty. During the day, he and Li Jinglong hurried along, and at night, they would rest in an inn. Li Jinglong thought that it was only because Hung Jun was close to going home that his spirits were low, so he couldn't help trying to think of things to lift his mood. At night, Li Jinglong would sit in front of the table, writing letters back to Chang'an, while Hung Jun would sit in a corner of the bed, holding a book, shooting him a glance every now and then. Out of the corner of his eye, Li Jinglong could see this. Naturally he knew that Hung Jun was staring at him, lost in his thoughts, and he didn't ask any further. The weather of early spring grew warmer, and the two of them kept heading south as well, so the snow and ice along the way slowly melted. Li Jinglong had specially chosen a path that led along the southern portion of Guangzhou, and after almost 10 days, there were even hints of green along the sides of the road. On the 12th day of the first month, the two of them actually came to the foot of the Taihang Mountains. When Hung Jun lifted his head to look towards the mountain valley, fear rose in his heart. He turned his head back to look at Li Jinglong, following behind him, but Li Jinglong was as composed as always as he looked into Hung Jun's eyes. Right then, Hung Jun suddenly had an impulse. He wanted to turn around and leave, and not return to Yejin Palace anymore. He opened his mouth, but he couldn't say a single word. "I'll be with you," Li Jinglong said. The truth is right there. In every person's life, there will always come at least once where you have to face it. Don't be afraid, Hung Jun. From Li Jinglong's gaze, Hung Jun gained confidence. "You've also faced it before?" Hung Jun asked, before turning his head to look towards the summits of the Taihang Mountains. Li Jinglong didn't respond to that. Hung Jun continued, "When?" He kicked his horse onwards to the Taihang Mountains, and Li Jinglong followed behind, neither too fast nor too slow. His eyes had mirth in them as he didn't respond. Hung Jun, however, had already come to a decision, and he was no longer afraid. Climbing the Taihang Mountains from the north, summits wreathed in clouds blocked the path forwards. The narrow road wound in on itself like a sheep's intestines, and wheels were unable to traverse it. In ancient times, there were the 8 passages of Taihang, which were 8 thoroughfares that led through the cloud-wrapped peaks. The first day upon entering the mountains, the war horses found even the stone roads to be extremely difficult, and many of the military passes here had already long since fallen into disrepair. The horses trod along the path at the waist of the mountain, but if they had even a single misstep, they would plummet down along the cliff. Thankfully, these 2 war horses had been chosen by Jia Zhou after last time, when Hung Jun had been corrupted by the devil Qi and killed the renowned Awan horses. These horses were even more understanding of humans, and they had actually made their way up, knocking about, just like that. As night fell, the 2 of them made a fire in the midst of a ruined military pass. During the day, they passed through heavy clouds and fog, heading towards the center of the mountain range. This was the first time Li Jinglong had entered the Taihang Mountains. Though he had heard before that this place was a place where even the swinging monkeys and flying birds could not survive, but he hadn't expected that it would be such a series of steep cliffs. "How exactly did you leave the first time?" Li Jinglong asked. The 2 of them led their horses slowly along the mountain path. The horses were already starting to grow a little afraid, and though one steed passed, the other stood there, unwilling to move. Li Jinglong pushed from behind, while Hung Jun pulled from the front, coaxing that horse to move forward little by little. "I depended on my own 2 feet the entire way," Hung Jun replied. "No wonder." Li Jinglong narrowly missed getting kicked by the horse. After crossing over that steep part, there was a huge meadow, where the earth veins gathered. There was also a hot spring here, and the 2 of them took a bath, the open air as their bath house, before looking upwards to the sky filled with a river of stars. Hung Jun turned onto his side, pillowing his head on his arm as he looked at Li Jinglong. The 2 of them were lying on the grass. "How about you wait for me here, ba?" Hung Jun said. "The path later is even harder to walk." "You underestimate me too much," Li Jinglong said, smiling. "If you don't come back, then what?" At that, Hung Jun smiled a little, complicated emotions swelling up in his heart. He turned over, his back to Li Jinglong, counting the blades of grass in front of him. Li Jinglong lifted his body a little, spreading his outer robe over the 2 of them, and they fell asleep just like that. End chapter. Legend of Exorcism. Chapter 72. The summit of the Taihang Mountains. The first month passed, and unknowingly, it had been over a month since they had left Dunhuang. There was a sense of unease in Hung Jun's heart, and the closer they got to the Taihang Mountains, that feeling grew stronger and stronger. Sometimes, he suddenly had the idea to turn around halfway with Li Jinglong, and sometimes, he hoped that this road had no end. It was as if as long as he separated himself from the human realm, many things would not happen, and he would not have to worry. They left their horses in the meadow, passing through the narrow slot canyon in the Taihang Mountains, then clambering up an ancient path laid down thousands of years ago up onto the summit. The vault of the sky was vast above them, and the only sound came from several flying birds. They had finished their rations, so Hung Jun taught Li Jinglong how to catch fish from the rivers. Hung Jun used his throwing knives to pin the fish in the water, and Li Jinglong would then catch them, bring them up, and light a fire to roast the fish. There were also quite a few berries and wild mushrooms in the forests that he didn't know the name of. Back then, Hung Jun had come down the mountain just like this. "It's that mountain there." Hung Jun pointed towards the snowy mountain in the distance. They were almost at their destination. To Li Jinglong's eyes, almost all the mountains looked the same. The two of them prepared 3 days' worth of rations, then Hung Jun took him twisting and turning through the trees, searching for the marks that he had made when he was coming down. They then climbed up the cliff using the vines. The wind was very strong, and this was Li Jinglong's first time climbing a mountain barehanded like this, and plus, Yejin Palace was specifically located somewhere only flying birds could reach. He and Hung Jun stood shoulder to shoulder on the cliffside. While Hung Jun was used to climbing up and down, he was afraid that Li Jinglong would take a wrong step, so he held his hand tightly. When they got to a narrow vertical cliffside, Li Jinglong wiped off a handful of sweat as he and Hung Jun looked up above their heads. Hung Jun then tossed out his grappling hook, which caught on a rock on the cliffside. He climbed up a stretch, stood firm, and tossed the line down to pull Li Jinglong up. Your family lives so high up. Li Jinglong only thought that he lived in some ancient temple at the top of a mountain. He hadn't expected that there wasn't even a road. Hung Jun replied, the view is very good at the top. Come ba. With that, Hung Jun tossed his grappling hook up again. Like this, every time he tossed it up, the two of them climbed up a stretch. Now Li Jinglong understood, Hung Jun's skills of leaping onto rooftops and vaulting over walls had actually been trained like this. When they neared the cloud layer, above their heads was already frozen ice that had accumulated for thousands of years, and where they stopped to rest halfway up the mountain, only a single person had set foot there before. Hung Jun and Li Jinglong stood almost on top of each other to rest, the two of them standing on a 2-chi rectangular outcrop that overlooked a steep cliff, pausing for breath. Hung Jun tossed the grappling hook up again, but instead, the hook caused all of the chunks of ice above their heads to come collapsing down with an earth-shaking thud. Watch out! Li Jinglong immediately turned and hugged Hung Jun. The cascade of ice plummeted downwards, and Hung Jun's heart leapt wildly as the two of them pressed together, their noses pressed together, both panting rapidly. The ice that fell wildly just happened to miss the two of them, plummeting into the deep valley below. It wasn't until a long while later that the noises lessened, and their breaths mingled as they stared into each other's eyes for a while. Hung Jun actually felt that both he and Li Jinglong had reactions to this. Li Jinglong's thing seemed to be pressing domineeringly against him, and Li Jinglong, mirth in his eyes, pressed two hands against the cliffside, looking at him with mischievous intent. How does it feel, being hugged like this? Li Jinglong said. He actually had the heart to poke fun at him. Tell me, did you start to fancy me a long time ago? Hung Jun's entire face was bright red, and he said, don't tease me. With only a slight move from Hung Jun, Li Jinglong immediately began to shout loudly, and he almost fell off. Hung Jun hurried to grab him, but in a flash, some more ice fell from above their heads, so Li Jinglong once again hugged him, the two of them both looking up. After a few more times, most of the ice had slid off, and only then did Hung Jun once again toss out the grappling hook. In the beginning, when Hung Jun had headed down the mountain, he had been sent by Qing Xiang down past the lone summit, but this road was one that he had often climbed before. If it was just him, going up and down was nothing. But with Li Jinglong in tow, the difficulty level clearly rose quite a bit. The sun set in the west, and Hung Jun clambered onto a cliff in the middle to rest his feet, before dangling the rope down. Li Jinglong kept sliding, and he finally made it up with great difficulty. It gets better from here on up, Hung Jun said. We've already passed the cloud layer, and there's no more ice up top. Let's rest for the night ba. After the battle in the Majao caves, Li Jinglong's right hand was still a little shaky. Despite that, he sat, shoulder to shoulder, with Hung Jun on a steep cliffside. At that time, the wind began to blow, and the sea of clouds parted. The golden light of the sunset shone out from the west side of the lone peak, over the vastness of the divine land, the coils of the mountain range, and the plains outside those mountains that stretched endlessly. How beautiful, Li Jinglong murmured. We didn't do all of that for nothing. Hung Jun replied, absent-mindedly, when I was still very small, My only wish was to leave the Taihang Mountains and go to take a journey in that red dust that Qing Xiang spoke about. How do you feel now? Li Jinglong asked, turning his head to look at Hung Jun. Hung Jun's youthful looks were so very bright and open, and his face was set in an expression of longing. Li Jinglong seemed to see that Hung Jun from the very beginning, a Hung Jun who was pure and clean. After leaving Chang'an, he had become low-spirited for quite a time. This left Li Jinglong completely baffled, but while they sat on the high mountains, watching that sunset whose light spanned thousands of li, the past him returned once more. The human realm is very good, Hung Jun murmured as he turned his head and began to smile. Li Jinglong slung his arm over Hung Jun's shoulders as the rays of the sunset washed over them. What is so good about it? Li Jinglong asked in response. Hung Jun thought for a moment, before saying confusedly, I don't know. When I was small, I wanted to learn some skills, and cultivate to become an immortal, Li Jinglong said absent-mindedly. I wanted to go to a mountain that no mortal could reach, to take an individual with great skills as a master. Yet you wanted to come to the human realm, to come to this red dust. Qing Xiang said, it's not fun on the mountain, Hung Jun said oddly, the human realm is fun. Even if you learn skills, wouldn't you still have to go back to the human realm? Otherwise, why would you go cultivate into a saint? To live for a long time, only to stay on a mountain, what purpose is there in that? Li Jinglong hurriedly chuckled. Of course I didn't want to learn skills just to go show them off to mortals. Hung Jun asked, then to protect the divine land? But I haven't seen a human realm devastated by the ravages of Yao and devils. In these years, the divine land has always been in a state of peaceful splendor. What made you believe in that book that Direnja left behind? A long time ago, Li Jinglong would have replied to him, but as he kept asking, Li Jinglong also began to feel a little doubtful. This desire was one that he had always felt strongly about. No matter if everyone mocked him for believing in monsters and random gods, no matter if he was like the man from Qi who was afraid of the sky falling in, that had never changed. Now that he thought about it, why was that the case? It was destined in my life, Ba, Li Jinglong said at last. Otherwise, I wouldn't have met you either. Hung Jun ed, leaning against his shoulder. The setting sun sank below the horizon, and the stars in the sky rose. At this moment, Hung Jun's mind was filled with a preternatural calm, and he was no longer filled with worries. When it grew light the next morning, Hung Jun began to clamber up once more. To reach the summit of the Taihang Mountains, this section was the last stretch, but also the most difficult. There were often steep cliff sides 5 or 6 zhang tall, with absolutely nowhere to get a hold on, only cracks in the stone face. Hung Jun tested several times, using his grappling hook to hook onto the crack. He climbed up first, stabbing the throwing knife into the crack and using his hand to dangle from it, before pulling Li Jinglong up. He then had him hold the throwing knife, using it like a steel wedge driven into the rock face to slowly, 1 zhang at a time, climb upwards. The waterfall of clouds surrounded them, rose, and flowed down. Li Jinglong held onto the knife with all of his might, saying, Hung Jun, I have one last question to ask you. What? Hung Jun looked down from up high. You haven't climbed the wrong mountain, right? Li Jinglong lowered his head to look under his feet. At this moment, he was holding onto a throwing knife wedged into the cliffside, and thousands of zhang under his feet. After the fog of clouds parted, the ground appeared, distant beyond belief. If he was to fall down from here, his body would instantly be pulverized. If we climb up, there's no way to get back down. Li Jinglong said. Hung Jun. Hung Jun hadn't thought of this question, and he came back to himself, immediately saying, it shouldn't be. Probably. When Li Jinglong heard this reply, he almost couldn't catch a breath and nearly fell down. With one hand holding onto the throwing knife, Hung Jun tossed out the grappling hook with the other, hooking onto the tall ledge jutting out from the summit. He hung onto the grappling hook, and with a flying leap, he kept pulling the rope back to himself. After several swings, he finally climbed up, and he let out a long breath as he stood onto the tall platform. Suddenly, he jolted and almost fell down. On the tall platform, a man stood in front of him. A fierce wind blew by, and the man's flame-red royal robe fluttered with it. The long bands drifted like the feathers of a phoenix, and one had long since been severed. His royal robe draped loose on him, slung over his shoulders, and his face was set in a cold expression, his golden eyes studying Hung Jun. That was Chong Ming. After meeting his gaze for a moment, Hung Jun immediately forgot what he was going to say, and in the end he quietly let out a call of "Dad." Hung Jun dash. Below him, Li Jinglong shouted, "Are you all right? Where'd you go?" Hung Jun came back to himself and hurriedly let down the rope, pulling Li Jinglong up. Li Jinglong panted for breath, his outer robe all mussed and disordered as he leaned against Hung Jun. When he straightened, as soon as he saw Chong Ming, he also clearly grew nervous. On Uncle Chong Ming, Li Jinglong hurried to cup his hands and greet him. "You still know to come back." Chong Ming's words, however, were directed at Hung Jun. Hung Jun only stood there silently, not saying a word. Chong Ming glanced at the two of them, before he let out a cold humph and turned and left. Hung Jun wanted to chase after him, but to one side, a youth had already come, saying quietly, "Your Highness. Your Highness, please come this way." "Dad. I have stuff to ask you." Hung Jun called out to Chong Ming, ignoring what the servant was saying. Chong Ming stopped and said darkly, "There will be a chance for you to do so later." He then spread his wings, turned into the phoenix and, shrouded in blazing flames, flew towards the palace in the distance. The two of them had climbed up to a platform outside the main hall of Yaojin Palace. There was a pool on this platform, and on the banks was planted a parasol tree. Li Jinglong stowed away the grappling hook, and the youths came forth to invite the guests in to rest. Hung Jun seemed to be very dejected, so Li Jinglong said, "Hung Jun, talk to him properly, don't fight with your father." Hung Jun could only nod, letting out a sigh. No matter what, it still felt very good to return home. He brought Li Jinglong through the main hall, heading along the outside corridor through the garden. When Li Jinglong saw that this place was planted full of spiritual grasses and heavenly plants, he asked, "These were all planted by you?" "They were all planted before," Hung Jun said, before he thought for a moment. "I'll take you for a stroll." "Let's go back and tidy up first," Li Jinglong smiled. "There's no rush." The land that Yaojin Palace occupied was easily some tens of thousands of Qing, and the servants in the palace, who were birds that had taken the form of humans, were all young men and women, almost 1,000 in count. The hall was built of nephrite jade. Nephrite? Jade. Li Jinglong was already completely struck dumb. Daming Palace, Xingqing Palace, Huaqing Palace, though the palaces of the human emperors were splendid, they were a far cry from this level. The entirety of Yaojin Palace was separated into the east, west, and middle 3 halls, and every hall had corridors crisscrossing, with carved railings and painted buildings. The style of architecture was even earlier than Han structures, and all of the furnishings were ancient artifacts from the 3 prehistoric dynasties to the Sui dynasty. The servants led Li Jinglong to the western hall. Over the doors, there was an image of a peacock feather much like the jade peacock plume that Hung Jun had. Even the cups for water were made of glazed glass, and there were many items made of gilded gold and soft smoke cloth. Even the shelf used for holding books was made from red sandalwood. "Li Zhenqi," a youth said, entering. "The water is prepared, and here are your clothes." Li Jinglong picked it up and took a glance, only to see that in this short Yaojin Palace had actually produced a change of robes that was exactly the same as his martial robe. The only difference was that the brocade and the materials used were even better. I'll do it myself. Even if Li Jinglong had been from a well-to-do family, he had never been subject to such extravagant luxury. After taking a bath, he changed his robes. The youths in Yaojin Palace, he figured, must all be birds, because they all went around with their upper bodies bare, only wearing a set of long pants, so that it was easy to stretch their wings. The clothes that had been made for Li Jinglong were a set of dark purple martial trousers. They had also specially prepared a set of wooden gi for him, as well as a thin, dark, short tunic for his upper body. Speaking of which, the summit of the Taihang Mountains was not cold at all, which was also strange. It was as warm as spring or summer, and he figured it was probably because the phoenix was there. Li Zhenqi, this way please. The youths came again to escort him. Li Jinglong figured that it was probably Hung Jun who had them calling him that, so he nodded and followed behind his guide, carelessly peeking into the rooms they passed with open doors. There was Hung Jun's library, there was the martial room used for practicing his throwing knives, with straw men and straw pigs and whatnot, and also a medicine storage, which had a ding, mortar and pestle, and a complete set of such necessities. Hung Jun had also just finished bathing, and his hair had been cut short, his head damp with water. The Yao tribes were not like mortals, they did not have the rule that because the hair and skin of the body was a gift from one's parents, it could not be harmed, and his short hair made him look even more lively. After returning to Yaojin Palace, he too had changed into a pair of navy blue brocade pants. He went around with his torso bare, used to it, and a youth was currently mixing some colors, drawing a dark blue pattern on his left chest like a tattoo. His skin was fair, and his muscles were well defined. His chest was extremely pretty, and after the pattern was drawn, it showed off even more the sex appeal of a young man. When can our place also get a hot spring or the like? Hung Jun was currently talking to the youths, but no one replied. With that, Hung Jun kept talking on his own, telling them a lot about what he had seen and heard down the mountain, especially about the hot springs of Walking Palace, and how they were very comfortable to soak in. The youths were afraid that if they responded, they would cause him to once again cause some trouble, so they maintained their silence. And the food down the mountain is super tasty, Hung Jun continued. Once in a while, we should have the chefs change things up. Li Jinglong smiled as he watched him from within the mirror. When Hung Jun saw that he had come, his face grew red. They usually dress like this, Hung Jun replied. But I'll go back and put on a shirt. Ba. Li Jinglong hurriedly waved his hand, but he remained silent as he looked Hung Jun up and down. Under that scrutiny, Hung Jun grew a little nervous, but it felt more as if he was feeling uncalled for excitement. What are you looking at? Hung Jun was torn between laughing and crying. Looking at how pretty you are, Li Jinglong said. Though there were many youths in Yaojin Palace, and they were all the most handsome and beautiful picked from amongst 100, none of them could compare to Hung Jun. Between his eyebrows, there was a natural aura of openness and cleanliness. The servant drew those feather patterns from Hung Jun's left shoulder to his chest, before bringing over a jade pendant for him to wear around his neck. Someone else came with the message that His Majesty was inviting the guests to partake of the meal. The sun set behind the western mountains, and Li Jinglong went to go eat. He imagined that since Hung Jun had just come home, he probably wanted to spend a little more time reuniting with Chongming on his own, so he told him there was no need to keep him company anymore. He didn't expect that not long after, Hung Jun came rushing back. I don't know where Chongming went, Hung Jun said. I'll eat with you. The servants brought in the food. Upon seeing it, it was a bowl of strange rice, along with soup made with fish and tofu, as well as eggs fried with tree leaves and a little bit of meat. Eggs. When Hung Jun saw Li Jinglong's expression, he knew what he was thinking. He continued, not my dad's eggs. Li Jinglong. Do you lay eggs? Li Jinglong suddenly asked. Even if I'm a Yaogwai, I'm still a male one. Hung Jun was torn between laughter and tears. Only the female ones lay eggs. Li Jinglong was merely teasing him, and he said, if you could give birth to a little Hung Jun like you, I imagine he'll be pretty fun to play with. Hung Jun gestured for Li Jinglong to hurry up and eat. The two of them were both hungry, but the rice in that bowl was not actually rice. Though it smelled light and fragrant as it entered the mouth, it felt extremely coarse as it was chewed. The rice is still this hard. Hung Jun choked on the rice to the point that he kept stretching his neck, and Li Jinglong hurriedly ladled soup for him. He then took a bite himself and said, isn't this bamboo rice? Hung Jun didn't know what kind of valuable ingredient bamboo rice was either. Li Jinglong thought to himself, of all of the beings living under this vast sky, the only one who could use bamboo rice to steam into rice was probably the phoenix. And to make bamboo rice this disgusting was probably something that only this family could do. And what meat is this? Rabbit, Hung Jun replied. Caught down the mountain. Li Jinglong now understood why Hung Jun acted like a hungry ghost when he was down the mountain, and how he kept eating like he could never be full. The reason was because all of the dishes in Yaojin Palace were extremely mild in taste, and basically without oil or salt. Even if it was stir-fried rabbit meat, it only used the natural fat of the rabbit to produce oil, nor was there any sauce with it. They had basically just used a large fire to speedily cook it. Rabbits are so cute, Hung Jun said. How come it can be made into such a disgusting dish? This is really a violent mistreatment of heavenly beings. Li Jinglong. The serving youth standing to the side kept listening to Hung Jun complain. Hung Jun ate some and then stopped, asking, have you guys eaten? Finally there was a response to this question, and everyone replied that they had. Hung Jun then had them all go outside, telling them there was no need to follow, and Li Jinglong didn't need to be escorted either. Only with that did the birds all spread their wings and disperse. Zhao Zilong, however, hasn't come back, Li Jinglong said. Hung Jun replied, that's perfect, otherwise it'll get scolded. And saying this, he went outside to dig through chests and upend shelves in searching for tea. He dug out half a bag of bamboo green tea, and he used boiling water to steep some in the glass cups, handing Li Jinglong one. The two of them sat in the corridor, watching the moon. Tonight, the moon was coincidentally full, and above the Taihang Mountains it was both big and bright. With the wind that blew over them, it was like a fairy realm on a summer night. This place is so beautiful, Li Jinglong said. Time also passes very fast, Hung Jun replied quietly. Before he had returned home, he hadn't wanted to, but now that he was home, he couldn't bear to leave. When you're at home, how do you usually pass the time? Li Jinglong asked. That magic of yours, did Chongming teach you it? Reading books, causing trouble, Hung Jun said. Chongming likes to sleep in the main hall. When Qingxiang comes, he usually plays with me for a few days. With so many birds, none of them are your friends? Li Jinglong asked. They aren't very good at speaking, Hung Jun said. It's not that they don't understand how, they've only cultivated for some tens of years, and their spiritual consciousness has not yet been awakened. They depend on my dad's spiritual power to take human form. Everyone can only help in simple ways and do a few things, they're not as intelligent as foxes. Whatever you teach them to say, they'll say. What we usually see are all the great Yaogwai. The Ghost King was originally a human, so he did not have to cultivate a spirit, and the Plague God and Suanu have both cultivated for 200 or 300 years, and their resentment hasn't even retreated yet. Zhao Zilong didn't chat with you? Li Jinglong asked again. It was afraid of being scolded for egging me on to cause trouble, Hung Jun replied, amused. My dad said that if it kept teaching me bad things, he would turn it into roasted fish. Li Jinglong recalled these halls gilded with gold and jade that he had just walked through, and he pictured the shadow of little Hung Jun running between the rooms. Hung Jun put down the glass cup in his hands, and the clear, Jade green tea reflected the full moon in the sky. A light breeze blew over, and the wind chimes hanging from the eaves tinkled. Hung Jun said, "Thank you for coming home with me, Zinchi." He stood up, and without saying another word he passed through the corridor under the moonlight. The light shone over his half-naked body, and Li Jinglong didn't turn his head as he suddenly said, "Hung Jun." At the end of the hallway, Hung Jun looked towards Li Jinglong sitting in the corridor as he had before, his back to him. Li Jinglong was silent for a very, very long time. He seemed to be a little nervous, and his long, slender fingers toyed with the glass cup, a small moon reflected in it. "Will you come back to Chang'an with me?" Li Jinglong asked, smiling with a little bit of hurt. "I keep feeling that after you've come back this time, you won't leave ever again." "I will," Hung Jun replied without even thinking about it. But just as Li Jinglong was about to lift his head, Hung Jun vanished into the end of the hallway. He walked past the grove of parasol trees, past that wall that he often had to face during his punishments, and then he couldn't resist coming to a stop. His heart thumped as if it was bursting out of his chest, and he was a little at a loss all of a sudden. He stood there dumbly, looking at the wall, not even knowing why he would let those words pass his lips. "Your Highness," a youth said. "His Majesty has requested your presence." Hung Jun hurried to turn, and with rapid steps he ran towards the main hall. After he had gotten into trouble and the main hall had been burnt, it had already been completely restored, but it was not wholly the same as how it had been before. A series of stone pillars held up the front of the hall, and behind it was the light of a bright moon. The thrones up high were as empty as they had been before, and on the platform close to the mountain range, there was a pool of water. A parasol tree had been planted on the banks, and under the parasol tree sat a person, that was Chongming. Hung Jun slowed in his steps, coming to a stop behind the parasol tree. When he was small, Chongming had often sat just like this by the side of the pool, his back against the parasol tree, and Hung Jun had sprawled out on his bare chest to sleep. As soon as he slept, a whole night would pass. End chapter.